Tonight, the streets of New York are alive with whispers, shadows, and secrets. From the smoke-filled lounges of 1950s Manhattan, where Frank Costello quietly pulls the strings of power, to the neon-lit avenues of the 1980s, where John Gotti, sharp-suited, audacious, untouchable, asserts his dominance over a city that never sleeps. Step inside the underworld, where loyalty is currency, perception is power, and every decision could be the difference between survival and oblivion. Welcome to the world of the Prime Minister and the Teflon Don. The streets of Manhattan glowed under the soft orange haze of streetlights, their illumination cutting through the fog rolling off the Hudson. It was late, close to midnight, but the city never truly slept. The hum of distant traffic mingled with the clatter of elevated trains and the low rumble of industrial engines, creating a pulse that mirrored the heartbeat of the underworld itself. Somewhere in the labyrinth of narrow alleys and smoke-filled lounges, Frank Costello moved like a shadow, the Prime Minister of the underworld himself, navigating a world where every glance and whisper held consequence. Stepping out of a taxi onto the corner of Mulberry and Hester Street, the faint scent of espresso, tobacco, and fried food curled around him. He adjusted his fedora, the brim casting a subtle shadow over his sharp, calculating eyes. Behind him, the amber light from the lounge sign flickered. O'Malley's, a place where deals were brokered quietly and bullets rarely flew but power always shifted. Tonight, as on every night, Costello walked in as though he owned the room, though in truth, the room owned him just as much. Inside, the lounge breathed with life. Smoke hung in the air, curling toward the ceiling like lazy specters, and the muted hum of conversation was punctuated by clinking glasses and the soft strains of a jazz piano. Men in tailored suits occupied the booths along the wall. Women, draped in silk and fur, leaned toward them, their laughter a delicate instrument in the otherwise deliberate cadence of the underworld. Costello's eyes swept the room with the precision of a chess master assessing the board. Every gesture, every subtle glance, told a story he already understood. He approached a table in the back where a local politician, one of many who owed him more than they realized, was nursing a scotch. "Good evening, Vincent," Costello said, voice smooth, velvety, with just enough weight to remind Vincent of the power hierarchy. The man looked up, startled, as though he hadn't expected the Prime Minister himself to appear so casually. "You're looking tired, my friend," Costello continued, sliding into the booth. "The city's been busy tonight." Vincent swallowed. "You know how it is, Frank. Always busy." Costello smiled faintly, leaning back. "Busy, yes. But busy can be guided, directed. That's the trick. Always guide the river, never fight it." As they spoke, Costello's mind never ceased calculating. Every deal, every favor, every whispered threat or promise was an instrument in a symphony only he could conduct. And yet, he understood that power in the shadows required patience, subtlety, and the occasional show of generosity. He wasn't brute force, he was persuasion itself. The lounge door opened again, letting in a gust of cold night air and the faint buzz of the street. Costello's gaze flicked toward it, casually noting the entrance of a courier, a young man from one of the smaller crews, carrying envelopes thick with unsigned contracts and whispered debts. Costello nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement, and the man understood immediately. The envelopes went into the briefcase. No questions, no delays. The machinery of the underworld moved quietly, almost invisibly, when guided by hands like Costello's. By the time he rose to leave, Costello had already spoken to 3 men whose influence could make or break ventures from the docks to City Hall. Each man left with a sense of having made a deal, though in reality, they had merely reinforced their loyalty and dependency on him. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling around the lampposts, muting the hum of the city. Costello walked down Mulberry Street, steps deliberate. He could hear the distant shouts of a street brawl, the crack of a bottle somewhere near the Bowery, but he paid them no mind. Such violence belonged to others. His battles were quieter, more insidious, waged in whispers and promises, in subtle nudges of political favor, and in the occasional, perfectly timed intimidation. As he passed under the fire escape of an old brick building, the shadows seemed to part respectfully, letting him pass. In another city, another life, a man might have called it luck or chance. In Costello's world, it was simply the result of a lifetime of understanding human nature, knowing which fears to stoke, which desires to feed, and which secrets to keep close. Crossing the street to his car, a black sedan from a local dealership, he paused to light a cigarette. The flame briefly illuminated his face, revealing the faint lines of age and experience etched into his skin. He inhaled deeply, letting the smoke curl upward, carrying with it the scent of tobacco and authority. Even in the darkest streets, even in the murkiest deals, Frank Costello felt a clarity that few could ever hope to understand. Driving through the quiet avenues, he passed storefronts closed for the night, neon signs flickering sporadically, and the occasional street lamp struggling against the fog. Every block, every alleyway seemed alive with potential, some of it opportunity, some of it danger. And Costello, as always, remained perfectly balanced between them. He was the calm in the storm, the whisper behind the decisions of men far more brash than he, the unseen hand that guided the pulse of New York's underworld. Reaching his modest brownstone, he parked, stepped out, and took a final drag from his cigarette. The city's fog wrapped around him like a cloak. Tonight, like every night, he had reinforced his dominion not through guns or brute force, but through the quiet assertion of influence, the subtle weaving of loyalty and fear, and the careful orchestration of human desire. He turned the key in the door, disappearing into the warmth of his home, leaving the city, and the shadows he commanded, waiting patiently for the next day's work. Because in New York, power never sleeps. And neither did Frank Costello. The morning air in Little Italy carried the scent of fresh bread and roasting coffee beans, mingling with the faint aroma of the river beyond the docks. The city was waking, but some parts, those tucked in alleys behind iron gates and shuttered storefronts, remained shrouded in shadows. Here, deals were whispered rather than shouted, and loyalty was currency. Frank Costello had left his brownstone hours ago, navigating the streets like a seasoned mariner steering through fog, plotting every interaction with precision. Costello's first stop was a small office tucked above a tailor shop, a place where papers, promises, and threats blended seamlessly. The room smelled of ink, aged leather, and the faint musk of cigar smoke. He greeted the men inside with calm authority, and as always each one stood a little taller, sat a little straighter, knowing that their fortunes, or misfortunes, rested upon his favor. "Gentlemen," Costello began, his voice smooth, measured, carrying a weight that made even the boldest men pause, "the city shifts daily and the tides do not wait. We must be ready to guide them, not be carried along by them." One of the younger men, nervous but ambitious, cleared his throat. "Frank, there's talk about the new crew moving through Queens. They're ambitious, loud, and not afraid to make mistakes." Costello's eyes narrowed, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Loud is easy to hear. Dangerous is quiet." He paused, letting the words settle. "Keep an eye on them, subtly. Learn their habits, their weaknesses. We don't react, we anticipate." He left the office with a nod, the men watching him descend the narrow staircase, shadows stretching along the walls as if bowing to his authority. The streets outside were alive with the ordinary chaos of New York. Street vendors shouting over the clang of the elevated trains, children darting between parked cars, and the occasional shout from a construction site down the block. Yet, beneath it all, the city whispered of something else, a pulse that only Costello, attuned to the rhythms of the underworld, could hear. Across town, a young man was making his way through a more flamboyant kind of territory. John Gotti moved with a swagger that demanded attention. Even at 25, he carried himself with a confidence that bordered on audacity. His suit was sharp, his shoes polished, and his presence impossible to ignore. Unlike Costello, who thrived in the shadows, Gotti seemed to draw strength from visibility. His eyes scanned the streets, noting potential allies and threats, absorbing the pulse of the city with an almost predatory focus. Gotti's crew met him at a small diner off Staten Island Avenue, a place far from the scrutiny of the major families but close enough to the docks to observe shipments and movements. "Word travels fast," one of his lieutenants said, setting a thick ledger on the table. "The families aren't sure what to make of you yet." Gotti leaned back, a grin spreading across his face. "Let them talk. Attention is a tool. Let them whisper while we act." He poured coffee into a chipped mug, watching the steam rise. "We move smart, we move fast. Fear isn't always the answer. Respect, earned, not given, is what lasts." While Gotti plotted, Costello was meeting with an influential councilman in a dimly lit office near City Hall. The councilman fidgeted as Costello laid out his plan for influence. Zoning approvals, construction permits, and favors that would quietly benefit the right people, people loyal to Costello. In another life this would have been politics. In this one it was survival. Every handshake, every smile, every nod reinforced a network invisible to the untrained eye, a web binding the city together in ways both legal and illicit. Costello's phone buzzed quietly, a coded message from a contact in Queens. A new crew was making moves, testing boundaries, testing his patience. He smiled faintly as if amused by their audacity. Patience, he murmured to himself, is the art of kings and criminals alike. Meanwhile, Gotti was testing the waters in Brooklyn, orchestrating small heists, learning the rhythms of his rivals, observing reactions and measuring loyalty. Unlike Costello, Gotti embraced risk, understanding that bold moves commanded attention and established reputation. Yet even he was learning the delicate dance of the city, where one misstep could bring down the strongest ambitions. Later that evening, Costello returned to Mulberry Street, to the familiar comfort of O'Malley's. The lounge was dimly lit, jazz notes drifting lazily through the air, smoke curling like specters around the heads of its patrons. Costello took his usual seat in the back, observing, listening, letting the city's murmur wash over him. Every whispered conversation, every raised eyebrow, every clink of a glass was data, feeding his mind, sharpening his instincts. Across town, Gotti's name was already being whispered. His reputation grew with every carefully calculated act. Small but strategic, designed to assert his presence without exposing too much. Yet, like Costello, he understood that alliances mattered as much as action. Respect was currency, loyalty the rarest commodity. And while Gotti's methods were flashier, more visible, the underlying principle was the same as Costello's. Influence was power, and power was everything. As night fell, the city transformed. Neon signs flickered to life, casting garish light over wet asphalt. The hum of traffic shifted into the thrum of nightlife, of secret meetings, of opportunities whispered behind closed doors. In the shadows, two men, one a master of subtlety, the other a rising force of audacious ambition, moved through the same streets, their paths destined to intersect, their methods different, but their ultimate goals remarkably similar: control, respect, and survival in the city that never slept. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of New York, deals were being made, alliances tested, and the delicate balance of power in the underworld continued its slow, inexorable shift. Frank Costello watched it unfold, unseen but omnipresent, while John Gotti, with youthful energy and audacity, carved his name into the streets, unaware of how closely the shadows had already taken notice. By the early 1970s, the streets of New York were a living, breathing organism of ambition, danger, and whispered loyalties. The city had changed, yet the underworld had its rhythms, familiar to those who knew where to look. Frank Costello, now older, his hair streaked with silver, remained the unshakable calm in the storm. His office on Mulberry Street smelled of old leather, polished wood, and the faint hint of cigar smoke, a sanctuary where decisions that shaped the city were made quietly. Costello leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing as reports filtered in. A new figure was making waves in Brooklyn, young but sharp, bold but calculating: John Gotti. The reports described him as audacious, commanding attention wherever he went, yet careful enough not to overextend. It was a dangerous combination in a world where a single mistake could mean death. Costello's eyes, trained for decades to read both men and movements, recognized the pattern immediately. Ambition, he muttered to himself. And it's the kind that doesn't hide. Meanwhile, Gotti was in a modest Brooklyn social club, the kind that hummed with jazz and conversation, far from the elite lounges of Manhattan. But these clubs were fertile ground for the young ambitious, places where alliances could be forged quietly, loyalty could be tested, and reputations could be built. Gotti, dressed in a dark suit with a crisp white shirt, scanned the room with a predator's focus. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered remark was data, intel he would use to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime. Respect, Gotti said to his lieutenant, leaning casually against the bar, isn't given. It's taken, earned, and reinforced daily. You show weakness even once and they'll remember it forever. The lieutenant nodded, understanding that in Gotti's world, lessons were learned through observation, and often through consequences harsher than words could convey. Across town, Costello received a call from one of his trusted men in Brooklyn, a subtle messenger bearing news. The young Gotti was growing in influence, and his methods, flashy, bold, commanding attention, were unorthodox yet effective. Costello leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, and allowed himself a thin smile. Interesting, he murmured. He was not threatened. Experience had taught him that raw energy without finesse was volatile, often self-destructive. Yet Gotti's combination of charm, boldness, and instinctive understanding of people was something Costello had to respect. That night, Gotti walked through the streets of Brooklyn with purpose. Neon signs flickered, cars passed with tires splashing puddles from a recent rain, and somewhere in the distance, a saxophone wailed a lonely tune from an open window. He paused, acknowledging a local bookmaker with a nod. Loyalty was currency, and Gotti had begun to accumulate wealth and reputation alike. As weeks passed, Gotti orchestrated a series of small but strategic operations, collecting debts, negotiating shipments, and enforcing his influence through a blend of respect and intimidation. Unlike the older families who relied on fear and tradition, Gotti understood the psychology of visibility. He embraced the media, the attention, the whispers in the streets. He was building a legend, even if the legend was still young and fragile. Back in Manhattan, Costello monitored these movements, not as a rival yet, but as a master observing a rising pawn. He understood that the young man's style, flamboyant, daring, unrestrained, was different from his own subtle, politically savvy approach. And yet, both methods aimed for the same ultimate prize: control over the city's underworld. One evening, Gotti attended a gathering at a Brooklyn banquet hall. The room was smoky, the chandeliers dimmed, and the hum of conversation masked the tension underneath. He moved among the tables with ease, greeting friends and subtly asserting dominance over those who might challenge him. Eyes followed him. Whispers spread. He was young, yes, but dangerous, and people sensed it. Costello, meanwhile, remained in his office, listening to updates, calculating the implications. He saw potential for collaboration, for influence, but he also recognized the seeds of conflict. The underworld was not a static entity. Power shifted, loyalties wavered, and ambitions clashed. The young man from Brooklyn could be a valuable ally, or a formidable opponent. That night, Gotti returned to his modest home in Queens. The streets were quieter now, but the tension of the day lingered. He sat at his kitchen table, poring over ledgers, planning, plotting, and reflecting. He knew that every move had consequences, that a misstep could unravel months of progress. Yet he thrived in the pressure, in the necessity of precise timing and bold execution. Costello, resting in his Manhattan brownstone, understood the weight of observation. Years of experience had taught him patience, the art of waiting for the right moment to act. Gotti was a spark in the underworld, unpredictable but brilliant, and Costello's mind raced with possibilities: mentor the young man, contain him, or simply let him rise until his energy burned out. Meanwhile, the city itself seemed to respond to the tension. Brooklyn and Manhattan, so close yet worlds apart in culture and influence, hummed with potential violence and ambition. Alleyways, docks, and hidden clubs were alive with the stirrings of power. The game was on, and every player, from street-level operators to seasoned bosses, was already moving in anticipation. By the time the first light of dawn touched the skyline, Gotti was already planning his next moves: strategic alliances, calculated intimidation, and opportunities to consolidate influence. Costello, on the other side of the river, contemplated how a man so young could alter the balance he had spent decades maintaining. Both understood in their own ways that New York's underworld was never still, never predictable, and always demanding attention. And so, the seeds of a new dawn were planted, not in confrontation but in observation, ambition, and the slow, deliberate accumulation of respect and fear. One man thrived in shadows, the other was emerging from them. The stage was set, and the city watched silently, holding its breath as two approaches to power began their inevitable intersection. The streets of Brooklyn had grown restless, alive with murmurs of a new force quietly asserting itself. Neon lights flickered along the avenues, illuminating puddles from a recent rain. The scent of gasoline, fried food, and smoke hung heavy in the air. John Gotti walked with measured confidence, his silhouette sharply defined against the glowing signs of neighborhood diners and bars. To the casual observer, he was just another man in a crisp suit, but in the underworld he was becoming something else entirely, a presence impossible to ignore. They called him the Dapper Don, a nod to his tailored suits, polished shoes, and the meticulous way he carried himself. But the nickname carried weight beyond fashion. It was a statement. He was a Don who commanded attention, who blended charm with an undeniable edge. Gotti understood that power was as much about image as it was about action. Respect was drawn to visibility, fear to boldness, and loyalty to the combination of both. Tonight, he was hosting a discreet gathering at a private club tucked away from the main thoroughfares. The patrons were a mix of seasoned crew members, younger operatives, and a few carefully vetted associates from neighboring families. Gotti moved among them with an effortless charisma, listening more than speaking, allowing the energy of the room to fill him. Every nod, every subtle smile, every quiet whisper reinforced his emerging legend. Across town, Costello remained in Manhattan, observing from a distance. The prime minister of the underworld was not one to be drawn into unnecessary conflict. but he could sense the ripples Gotti's rise was creating. A young, audacious Don, bold enough to court attention, risked destabilizing the delicate balance he had spent decades cultivating. Costello had faced ambitious men before, some who burned out quickly, others who posed more lasting threats. Gotti, he realized, could be either. Back in Brooklyn, Gotti's attention turned to business. A shipment of contraband was scheduled to arrive by nightfall, and he had orchestrated its interception with precision. The operation was small but symbolic. Every action, every success reinforced his reputation and demonstrated his competence. Men watched, some with awe, some with envy, as he directed the logistics with a combination of charm and quiet authority. His smile never wavered, his suit remained immaculate, his hands never trembled. The whispers in the streets grew louder. "Did you see Gotti at the club last night?" someone said in a shadowed alley. "That suit, that smile, the man's untouchable." "Untouchable," repeated another, a hint of disbelief in his voice. That single word, while spoken casually, would follow him like a shadow over the next several years. That evening, Gotti met with key lieutenants in a backroom of a familiar Brooklyn diner. The conversation was low, deliberate. "We move with precision," he said, voice steady, eyes locking onto each man's. "Every crew, every shipment, every man who steps out of line, we account for them. But we do it smart. No mistakes. Visibility is power, but reckless visibility is death." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We're not just building fear. We're building a reputation. One that lasts." Meanwhile, Costello was orchestrating his own quiet maneuvers in Manhattan. Political favors, careful nudges of law enforcement, and subtle guidance of city contracts. All actions designed to maintain influence without drawing the chaos of attention. Yet even he could not ignore the growing legend in Brooklyn. Gotti's audacity, combined with intelligence and charm, had begun to shape the streets. Gotti, however, thrived on the tension. He understood the psychology of the underworld. Visibility was a tool, fear a weapon, and charisma an amplifier. Every handshake he offered, every subtle threat delivered in tone rather than action, reinforced his position. And as the city whispered about him, the media would eventually catch wind, amplifying the aura of the Dapper Don. One night, after a successful collection, Gotti and his men returned through the narrow streets of Brooklyn. The fog, thick from the East River, clung to lampposts and slick asphalt. Shadows twisted, creating an atmosphere of anticipation. A rival crew had made a misstep, an insult, a failure to deliver a promise. Gotti's men whispered about retribution, but Gotti raised his hand, a gesture of both command and calm. "We move, yes," he said quietly, "but not recklessly. We act when the moment is perfect and when it benefits us most." The men nodded. They trusted him because he was precise, controlled, and, above all, calculated. Every move had intention. Every action was deliberate. As dawn approached, Gotti returned to his home in Queens, suit still sharp, demeanor steady. The day's events replayed in his mind. Alliances tested, reputations built, and messages sent without a word. He had begun to assert dominance not just through force, but through strategy, presence, and the careful cultivation of myth. Costello, observing from Manhattan, understood the inevitability of the clash. The young Don from Brooklyn was no ordinary upstart. His methods, bold and visible, threatened the stability of the older guard. And yet, Costello also appreciated the brilliance behind the audacity. Gotti was learning the game quickly, and while his approach differed, the objective remained the same: command respect, establish authority, and survive in the ruthless ecosystem of New York's underworld. By the time the city awoke fully, the legend of the Dapper Don was beginning to take shape. Brooklyn streets buzzed with anticipation and fear, whispers trailing behind a man who had learned to bend perception to his will. And across the river, Manhattan's shadows held a seasoned observer, calculating, patient, waiting for the moment when ambition and experience would finally collide. The city was alive with movement, yet the pulse of power beat quietly beneath its surface. Manhattan, with its grand edifices and bustling avenues, concealed a labyrinth where influence traveled through whispers and handshakes rather than speeches and ballots. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, had long mastered this world. His office near City Hall, tucked behind layers of brick and shuttered windows, smelled of aged leather, ink and cigar smoke, the scent of authority. Costello leaned back in his chair, reviewing a stack of documents. Zoning approvals, construction permits, campaign contributions, and discreet letters from city councilmen. Each page represented leverage, a calculated nudge, or a hidden favor that could be used to orchestrate outcomes favorable to him and his associates. To the untrained eye, these were ordinary bureaucratic matters. To Costello, they were chess pieces, each move meticulously considered. "Every politician has a price," Costello murmured, fingers tapping lightly against the polished oak of his desk. "Not always money, sometimes loyalty, sometimes silence, sometimes fear." Across town, the streets buzzed with activity. Cars honked, shopkeepers shouted greetings, and the familiar scent of bagels and roasted coffee drifted through the air. Yet beneath this everyday chaos, the underworld pulsed with schemes and negotiations. Costello navigated both worlds seamlessly. Where others saw routine, he saw opportunity. At a discreet luncheon in a private Manhattan club, Costello met with a councilman whose ambitions exceeded his experience. The man fidgeted, adjusting his tie nervously as Costello's gaze measured him, reading not just his words but his intentions, his hesitations, the subtle tremor of ambition in his tone. "Frank," the councilman began, "the developers, they're pressing for approval on the waterfront project. There's some opposition but—" Costello raised a hand, a small, elegant gesture that stilled the room. "Let me stop you there," he said calmly. "The project moves, but not for them, not for the public, but for the right people. You understand? Influence is invisible. People should feel it, not see it." The councilman swallowed. "Yes, I understand." Costello leaned forward, voice dropping into that subtle timbre that commanded attention without shouting. "I've invested in your success. Guide the right decisions and you prosper. Ignore them or act foolishly and, well, Manhattan is full of surprises, isn't it?" Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Elevated trains rattled overhead, fire escapes rattled in the wind, and sirens wailed in the distance. But in Costello's orbit, time slowed. Deals were made in silence, alliances forged in nods, and threats delivered in the spaces between words. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, John Gotti continued his own quiet campaign. Word of his calculated actions, precision in enforcement, and increasing influence had begun reaching Manhattan's older families. Gotti, young but ambitious, understood the psychology of fear and respect, and he wielded both like instruments in a symphony. Yet he also recognized that to rise further, he needed more than street-level control. He needed visibility and perception. Costello, observing these developments from a distance, began considering the implications. The young man was bold, flashy, and growing in reputation. He could disrupt established patterns if left unchecked, or he could be guided, subtly influenced, and used to Costello's advantage. Patience was crucial. Timing, as always, would determine the outcome. That afternoon, Costello attended a gala fundraiser, a carefully constructed display where politics and underworld influence intertwined seamlessly. Men in tailored suits shook hands, women in silk gowns exchanged knowing glances, and champagne flowed freely. Costello navigated the room effortlessly, offering smiles, nods, and a few carefully chosen words. Each interaction was a transaction, invisible but powerful. A young council aide approached him nervously, holding a folder. "Mr. Costello, these documents, the mayor requested your insight on the zoning approvals." Costello glanced over them quickly, eyes flicking across details unnoticed by anyone else. "Subtle pressure here, a friendly suggestion there. Influence doesn't announce itself," he said, handing the folder back. "Guide them wisely. Let them believe it was their idea." As he exited the gala, stepping into the chilly Manhattan night, Costello lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the mist rolling off the Hudson. Every street lamp, every honking car, every passing pedestrian seemed a background chorus to the intricate ballet of influence he conducted daily. Meanwhile, across the city, Gotti was making moves to solidify his Brooklyn presence. A shipment arrived at the docks, a small but valuable test of loyalty for his crew. The operation was flawless, reinforcing respect and fear simultaneously. He understood that control required not just muscle but perception, timing, and psychological mastery. That evening, Costello reviewed reports, piecing together the networks of influence threading through Manhattan and Brooklyn. He considered the young man from Brooklyn, calculating the intersections of ambition, boldness, and vulnerability. Gotti's rise was not yet a direct threat, but it was inevitable that their worlds would collide. When it happened, Costello would be ready, quiet, deliberate, and unassailable. And so, in the heart of New York, two approaches to power operated in parallel. One, refined and subtle, conducted from behind the velvet curtain of political influence. The other, bold and audacious, building reputation and authority on the streets. Both men sought the same ultimate prize: respect, authority, and the ability to shape the city according to their will. By midnight, the city had quieted slightly, but in the hidden corners, boardrooms, offices, alleys, and lounges, decisions that would shape the next decades were being made. Costello, smoking quietly by his window, and Gotti, planning his next strategic move, existed in separate spheres of influence yet shared a common rhythm: the relentless pursuit of power in the city that never slept. And as the first light of dawn crept over the skyline, Manhattan and Brooklyn were alive with possibility, tension, and the unspoken understanding that the game of power was only just beginning. The nights in New York carried a different kind of weight now. The hum of traffic, the wail of distant sirens, the whisper of wind curling through alleyways, each was a reminder that the city lived in layers, some visible, some lurking just beyond perception. Frank Costello, older now, walked through the familiar streets of Manhattan with the same measured pace he had maintained for decades. Yet even he could sense the subtle tremors in the underworld. Something was shifting, a new force growing bolder with each passing day. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, John Gotti orchestrated operations with a precision and audacity that made even seasoned observers take notice. The Dapper Don's reputation for charm and meticulous planning was expanding into something more formidable. Where before he had tested loyalty and calculated alliances, now he executed targeted actions that commanded attention, acts of violence carefully staged to instill both fear and respect. A small crew of rival operators had mismanaged a debt collection, failing to deliver the agreed-upon sum and insulting Gotti's authority in the process. In another era, such an infraction might have been overlooked or quietly corrected. Not for Gotti. The streets needed to understand that respect was not optional. That evening, in a shadowed warehouse near the docks, he gathered his closest lieutenants. "This isn't just about money," Gotti said, voice low, controlled, yet carrying a chilling edge. "It's about reputation. Every move we make sends a message. Let them think twice before crossing us again." Orders were given, precise and deliberate. The act itself was swift, efficient, and calculated to avoid unnecessary attention from law enforcement. By dawn, the message had been received. Gotti was a Don who acted decisively, and those who underestimated him did so at their peril. Across the river, Costello received updates through his trusted network. He studied the reports carefully, noting the efficiency, boldness, and strategic insight displayed in each incident. Gotti was no longer just a flash of audacity in Brooklyn. He was a growing force, capable of influencing the balance of power in ways subtle observation alone could not mitigate. Costello understood the psychological impact. Violence, when applied with precision, was more than physical. It was communication. Every act, every reaction, every ripple through the network reinforced hierarchy and obedience. Gotti had mastered this language quickly, learning not just how to strike but when to strike and how to let the threat linger even after the act was complete. That night, Manhattan streets were cloaked in fog, street lamps casting long shadows across wet pavement. Costello, standing by his office window, observed the glow of the city, thinking in patterns, assessing reactions, and anticipating moves. He did not panic. Experience had taught him that a rising force could be contained or guided, but only with patience and precision. Meanwhile, Gotti returned to his Brooklyn home after inspecting his operations. The adrenaline of control mixed with the calculated thrill of risk. Every crew member under his command was more disciplined, more attentive, more aware of the stakes. He reviewed reports, plotted logistics for the coming weeks, and considered the alliances yet to be formed. The streets themselves seemed to bend subtly to his will, a network of whispers and fear reinforcing his emerging dominance. In Manhattan, Costello convened a meeting with several influential political figures, law enforcement contacts, and trusted operatives. They discussed zoning approvals, construction projects, and strategic support, all while keeping a careful eye on Brooklyn's rising dawn. Costello understood that the underworld was a living organism. Every movement of power required anticipation and adjustment. By now, Gotti's notoriety was spreading beyond Brooklyn. Murmurs in Manhattan, whispers in bars, subtle news items hinting at his influence, all contributed to a growing legend. He had not yet reached the pinnacle, but the foreshadows of violence had begun to define him. Those who had once ignored his presence now paused, measured their steps, and reconsidered allegiances. Costello, always vigilant, mapped out potential outcomes in his mind: mentor, contain, or let rise until his energy burned out. Each scenario carried risk, and yet he moved with the calm of a man who had seen ambition tested countless times before. He understood the stakes, not just for himself, but for the delicate web of loyalty and influence he had built over decades. Meanwhile, Gotti's crew executed further operations designed to reinforce his authority. A shipment misappropriated by a neighboring crew was retrieved without hesitation. Subtle threats were delivered, ensuring obedience without the need for reckless exposure. The message was clear: the Teflon Don did not tolerate incompetence, and every action reinforced the myth of invincibility that would follow him for years to come. Late that night, Gotti walked along the Brooklyn waterfront, the East River shimmering under the faint glow of streetlights. He reflected on the delicate balance between visibility and subtlety, between fear and respect. The world was dangerous, yes, but calculated action created a landscape where one could thrive, even dominate. He thought of Manhattan, of Costello, and the vast network of influence stretching across the city. He recognized that to ascend fully he would need more than street-level power. He would need the city itself to bend subtly in response to his movements. Costello, in his Manhattan office, continued his silent observation, noting Gotti's rise, the efficiency of his operations, and the inevitable shift in power. The foreshadows of violence were no longer just isolated incidents, they were signals of change. And in the world of New York's underworld, change could be as deadly as any bullet. By dawn, the city had begun its daily rhythm. Newsstands opened, subways rumbled to life, and street vendors called greetings to passers-by. Yet beneath the surface, the underworld throbbed with tension and anticipation. Gotti's calculated actions had left an imprint on the streets, and Costello's patience was measured against a growing force that could not be ignored. In the quiet corners, in smoky lounges, in dimly lit offices, the game of influence, power, and survival continued. One man thrived in shadows and subtlety, the other, emerging boldly, was beginning to command attention through decisive, violent action. The city held its breath, waiting for the next move in a chess game where every piece was alive, and every action carried consequences far beyond the streets themselves. And somewhere, in the fog and neon glow of New York, the seeds of future confrontations were already taking root. The neon glow of 1980s Manhattan painted the streets in harsh pinks and electric blues. Sparks Steakhouse, a corner fixture in the heart of Midtown, pulsed with life, laughter, and the faint scent of charred meat mixed with cigarette smoke. Inside, a delicate dance of power played out between businessmen, mobsters, and political figures. The air was thick with anticipation, and the shadows in the corners seemed almost alive, listening. John Gotti adjusted the cuffs of his silk suit, a practiced gesture that belied the tension coiled in his chest. "Tonight," he whispered to his lieutenants, voice low but firm, "we remind the world why respect isn't optional." Every word carried authority, every pause punctuated the gravity of what they were about to do. Outside, the streets of Manhattan thrummed with traffic, honking cars, rumbling subways beneath the asphalt, distant sirens. But Gotti's attention was focused inward, toward Sparks Steakhouse and the men inside who had underestimated him. Among them, a rival boss, long considered untouchable, sat comfortably, oblivious to the storm about to strike. Gotti's crew moved like shadows, coordinated, silent, precise. They had rehearsed the logistics countless times: positioning, timing, escape routes. The streets, slick with a recent rain, reflected the neon like liquid glass, casting surreal patterns on the pavement. Every detail mattered, every movement was part of a carefully orchestrated symphony. Inside the restaurant, laughter and the clink of glasses masked the tension that would erupt moments later. Gotti entered casually, a subtle smile on his face, exuding charm and control. To any outsider, he was just another well-dressed patron. To those who knew, he was the apex predator, calculating, patient, deadly. The moment arrived. In a flurry of motion too swift to fully register, Gotti's men executed the operation. The sound of gunfire shattered the ambient noise, echoing through the room like a brutal percussion. Panic erupted, tables overturned, and patrons scrambled for cover. The targeted men, those who had thought themselves invincible, fell precisely as planned. Every detail of the attack had been calculated for maximum impact and minimal exposure. In the chaos, Gotti remained calm, surveying the scene with unshakable composure. The power of fear and surprise radiated outward, touching everyone in the room. This was not merely an act of violence. It was a declaration, a calculated assertion of authority that would resonate through the city for years to come. Across the river in Manhattan, Frank Costello received updates through his network. He studied the reports, his expression unreadable. The precision, audacity, and public nature of the hit were textbook Gotti, bold, unflinching, yet strategically sound. Costello understood the implications immediately. The underworld landscape was shifting irrevocably. This was no longer a distant threat. It was a force actively reshaping the balance of power. News spread quickly. Newspapers carried blurred images and cautious reports, television anchors speculated on motives, and the public fascination grew. Gotti, now fully embracing his emerging legend, moved through the attention with ease, feeding the myth without overexposure. He was the Teflon Don, untouchable in the eyes of the law, untouchable in reputation, untouchable in legend. In Brooklyn, Gotti met with his lieutenants afterward. They reviewed every detail, every contingency, every escape route. Success had been achieved without misstep. The message was clear. Crossing Gotti was not a question of negotiation, it was a test of survival. Costello, ever vigilant, observed the ripples. The Prime Minister of the underworld understood that audacity could succeed, but also recognized the volatility it carried. Gotti's rise was meteoric, his tactics direct, and his reputation spreading faster than any whispers Costello had ever cultivated. Yet the older Don also appreciated the brilliance behind the boldness, strategy wrapped in spectacle, efficiency hidden in chaos. That night, Gotti walked the streets of Manhattan, absorbing the residual energy of the city, the fear, the awe, the attention. Every neon reflection on the wet pavement reinforced his control, every shadow a reminder of the networks he had activated, every whisper an acknowledgement of his authority. Costello in Manhattan contemplated the inevitable. The young Don from Brooklyn had demonstrated not just ambition but capability, the combination of intelligence, audacity, and psychological mastery that defined true power. The landscape had changed. The subtle threads of influence Costello had woven over decades now intersected with the bold, public force of Gotti. By the time dawn crept over the skyline, Manhattan and Brooklyn were buzzing with rumors, calculations, and the quiet tension of a world reshaped. Sparks Steakhouse was no longer just a restaurant, it was a symbol, a pivot point in the city's underworld. And at the center of the storm, John Gotti had solidified his legend, leaving an indelible mark on New York and setting the stage for the years to come. The collision between subtlety and spectacle, patience and audacity, shadow and neon had begun. And neither the city nor the men who navigated it would ever be the same again. The morning after the Sparks Steakhouse hit, Manhattan awoke to a city still buzzing with whispers. Neon lights had dimmed, the streets were quieter, but the impact of the previous night's events lingered like a phantom. Newsstands displayed cautious headlines, photographs of broken glass and overturned tables, the chaos frozen in black and white. The city, ever hungry for spectacle, devoured every detail, piecing together a narrative of audacity and danger. John Gotti sat in his modest Brooklyn apartment, the soft hum of the East River filtering through the window. He poured a cup of coffee, savoring the calm before the storm. Outside, the streets reflected the neon and morning light on slick asphalt, a quiet contrast to the violence that had marked the night. Gotti's mind, however, was anything but calm. Every action taken, every reaction observed, became a lesson in influence, psychology, and power. The hit had been flawless. Rivals had been neutralized, respect reinforced, and fear instilled, all without any immediate blowback from law enforcement. The city's whispers elevated Gotti's reputation, the Teflon Don, untouchable, unassailable, already a myth in the making. He understood that perception was as important as reality, that legend could act as a shield, and that timing was everything. Across the river, Frank Costello observed quietly from Manhattan. The Prime Minister of the underworld, always patient, always calculating, reviewed reports filtered through trusted contacts. He noted the precision of the attack, the public attention it had drawn, and the strategic genius that had ensured minimal exposure to legal consequences. Costello's expression remained unreadable. His mind, however, raced. Gotti's rise was no longer a distant ripple. It was a tidal wave reshaping the balance of power. Costello considered options: intervene subtly to guide the young Don, contain him by leveraging alliances, or wait and watch, letting ambition and audacity eventually meet the consequences that inexperience often brought. Meanwhile, Brooklyn responded in kind. Local crews adjusted behavior, some pledging loyalty, others retreating cautiously into the shadows. Gotti's message was clear. Authority was now absolute, and visibility mattered as much as force. Every whispered conversation in a diner, every glance along a street, carried the weight of his presence. Costello, reflecting on the unfolding events, recognized the shift in strategy required. His method of quiet influence, manipulation from the shadows, remained effective, But the dynamics were changing. The audacity of Gotti's public actions meant that subtler forms of power had to adapt. Political connections, police influence, and carefully nurtured loyalty would now intersect with the raw visibility of force, creating a delicate balance that required even greater foresight. In the following days, Gotti navigated the sudden surge of attention with calculated ease. Journalists, curious onlookers, and law enforcement all began to take notice, each interaction carefully managed. His team reinforced discipline, ensuring that every crew member understood the importance of precision, discretion, and timing. Mistakes were unacceptable. Loyalty and competence became non-negotiable. Costello, on the other hand, strengthened his network. Councilmen, police contacts, and influential businessmen received subtle guidance and reassurances. He understood that while Gotti's actions commanded public attention, the quiet threads of control, political influence, legal leverage, and strategic partnerships would continue to shape the broader landscape. The city, a living organism of ambition and danger, adjusted to the new reality. Brooklyn streets whispered of the Dapper Don, Manhattan's offices buzzed with calculations of influence, and the underworld's delicate equilibrium shifted imperceptibly yet irrevocably. Those who had underestimated the young Gotti were learning quickly, and even seasoned observers acknowledged that a new force had emerged, one that combined audacity with intelligence, charisma with lethal precision. That evening, Gotti returned to his apartment, walking past the familiar streets of Brooklyn with a quiet satisfaction. He had acted decisively, strategically, and effectively. The city's energy mirrored his own, restless, anticipatory, and charged with possibility. Every shadow, every reflection in the wet pavement, every whisper carried the story of the Dapper Don, cementing his position in the underworld. Costello, reviewing the outcomes from Manhattan, understood the necessity of adaptation. Influence alone was no longer sufficient. Audacity had entered the equation. The underworld's landscape demanded a nuanced response, subtle, patient, yet ready to confront boldness with strategy. The chessboard had changed, and every move now required recalibration. By midnight, the city settled into a deceptive quiet. The newspapers printed cautious summaries, the police strategized internally, and the public speculated endlessly. But in the hidden corners, boardrooms, lounges, offices, and alleyways, the game of influence continued, now marked by a new axis of power. Gotti had emerged as a formidable figure, a symbol of audacity and calculated risk. Costello, vigilant and patient, remained a master of shadows, his strategy evolving to account for the bold force rising in Brooklyn. And so, New York adjusted to the aftermath, the echoes of Sparks Steakhouse reverberating through every corridor of power. In the quiet and the chaos alike, the stage was set for a confrontation that would define the next chapter of the city's underworld. A collision of audacity and subtlety, visibility and control, ambition and experience. By the mid-1980s, the streets of New York were alive with more than just the hum of traffic and the murmur of everyday life. They carried the whispers of legend. John Gotti, fresh from his decisive moves in Brooklyn and the infamous Sparks Steakhouse hit, had become the subject of fascination, speculation, and outright fear. The city's tabloids, always hungry for spectacle, picked up the story with fervor. Every article, every broadcast, every word in the public sphere elevated him beyond mere street-level notoriety. He was no longer just a rising figure, he was a symbol. The Teflon Don, they called him, a nickname that would stick like glue to his reputation. It was a moniker born not only from his seeming invincibility in the face of law enforcement but also from the mythic aura he cultivated, intentionally or not. Court appearances became theater, public scrutiny a stage upon which he performed with calm, almost theatrical composure. Photographs captured his sharp suits, the glint of rings on his fingers, and the ever-present, confident smile. Every image, every headline reinforced the legend. Gotti, aware of the power of perception, played the part with precision. He knew the media was a tool as potent as any weapon, capable of shaping fear and respect alike. "Let them talk," he told his lieutenants one evening, sitting in the dim light of a Brooklyn club. "Every whisper, every story, they're writing our reputation for us. Don't fight it. Use it." Back in Manhattan, Frank Costello watched from the quiet of his brownstone, the city's skyline stretching beyond the window. The reports filtered in, Gotti's name in print, analysis on television, speculation on radio. Costello's expression remained calm, measured, but inside, calculations ran like machinery. The Dapper Don was no longer a distant force. He was an active variable in a system Costello had spent decades refining. Costello understood that myths had power. They could shape behavior, intimidate rivals, and manipulate the perception of allies. He had mastered the subtle manipulation of influence, threading his control through political contacts, police, and businessmen alike. But Gotti's visibility introduced a new dynamic: public attention as leverage, fame as armor, audacity as strategy. The young man was redefining the rules of engagement. In Brooklyn, Gotti's operations expanded. Each successful action, whether the strategic collection of debts or the careful enforcement of loyalty, was amplified by media coverage. The streets whispered, businesses adjusted behavior, and rival families recalibrated their strategies. Every move reinforced the myth of untouchability. And every time the law attempted to corner him, he maneuvered, slipping through technicalities and legal loopholes, a dance that added fuel to the Teflon legend. Costello, ever vigilant, analyzed the implications. His strength had always been patience, discretion, and subtlety, yet he recognized that audacity combined with calculated visibility could rival even decades of shadowed maneuvering. He considered the possibilities: partnerships, containment, or strategic opposition. The chessboard had expanded, and every piece now had a public presence to contend with. Meanwhile, journalists pursued the story relentlessly. Every court appearance, every social interaction, every public sighting was dissected and disseminated. Photographers captured Gotti in his tailored suits, casual gestures, confident smiles, projecting an image of unshakable authority. Television crews speculated on motives, analysts debated implications, and the public fascination soared. Gotti became a household name, a symbol of cunning and audacity in a city already enamored with its own myths. In private, Gotti discussed the growing legend with his closest lieutenants. "Perception is reality," he said, voice firm, eyes scanning the room. "Every word spoken about us, every headline, it's all part of our power. Control the story, control the fear, control the respect. Never let anyone else write it for you." Costello, listening through trusted intermediaries, recognized the brilliance of the strategy. The audacity of playing with public perception was bold, effective, and inherently dangerous. Myths could protect, but they could also invite challenges, embolden rivals, and create vulnerabilities. Costello contemplated the intersections between Gotti's visible, audacious approach and his own hidden, politically savvy method. Timing, patience, and calculated response would be key. The city adjusted to the new reality. Manhattan offices whispered strategies, Brooklyn streets moved cautiously, and law enforcement scrambled to comprehend the implications of a figure who seemed untouchable, almost mythic. Gotti's actions had transformed him from a local boss to a legend, and with that transformation came both opportunity and risk. By nightfall, Gotti walked through the streets of Brooklyn with a quiet satisfaction. The media had done its work, the streets had acknowledged his authority, and his crew understood the rules. The Teflon Don was no longer just a nickname, it was a living narrative, a symbol of invincibility woven through the fabric of New York. Costello, meanwhile, remained in the shadows, assessing, planning, and adapting. The myth of the Teflon Don was now part of the game, a factor he had to account for in every political move, every alliance, every subtle manipulation of power. The underworld's landscape had changed, and the dance between visibility and subtlety, between audacity and patience, was entering its next, more dangerous phase. As the neon glow faded into the quiet of late night, the city held its breath. In boardrooms, lounges, offices, and alleys, the myth of John Gotti influenced behavior as surely as any decree or threat. And in the shadows, Frank Costello waited, calculating the moves necessary to maintain relevance, influence, and control in a world where legends could rise and fall overnight. New York streets had grown tense, the city a living organism sensing every shift in the balance of power. In the shadows of Manhattan and Brooklyn alike, whispers circulated, not just of Gotti's audacity, but of challenges that could undo even the most carefully constructed reputation. For John Gotti, the rise had been meteoric, but the higher the ascent, the more perilous the summit became. It started subtly. A trusted lieutenant failed to follow orders, mishandling a minor debt collection. Though minor, it sent ripples through the network, revealing cracks that rivals could exploit. Gotti's response was measured, not rash but deliberate, reinforcing authority without exposing himself unnecessarily. In the underworld, survival demanded clarity under pressure, decisiveness cloaked in restraint. The FBI, long aware of Gotti's growing influence, increased surveillance. Wiretaps, undercover agents, and carefully placed informants began to map the network he had built. The danger was palpable, the stakes escalating from territorial disputes to life-and-death stakes against law enforcement. Yet Gotti, ever mindful of perception, maintained composure. Every court appearance, every interaction projected confidence, ensuring that even scrutiny became a tool rather than a threat. Meanwhile, Manhattan remained under Costello's watchful eye. The Prime Minister of the underworld analyzed reports and rumors, noting the evolving dynamics. Gotti's visibility, while bold, also presented vulnerabilities. Costello considered potential interventions, subtle alliances, strategic containment, or simply letting events unfold to see whether the young Don could sustain his momentum. The chessboard of New York's underworld was shifting, and each move carried amplified consequences. One evening, a betrayal became undeniable. A mid-level operator, swayed by rival families and tempted by promises of power, attempted to subvert Gotti's authority. The misstep could have been disastrous, but Gotti's foresight, meticulous planning, and network of loyal operatives mitigated the damage. The traitor was quietly neutralized, a lesson for others. Loyalty and competence were not optional in the hierarchy he commanded. Public perception, meanwhile, continued to shield him. Media coverage portrayed Gotti as untouchable, a figure who could weather scrutiny, survive legal attacks, and emerge unscathed. The moniker Teflon Don was no longer rumor. It was legend solidified in the public imagination. Every legal challenge, every internal threat, only seemed to strengthen his aura of invincibility. Costello, observing these developments, recognized the interplay between audacity and prudence. While Gotti's methods relied on visibility, bold action, and controlled violence, Costello's strategy remained subtle, indirect, and rooted in decades of influence. Their paths, though separate, were increasingly entwined. The younger Don's survival and ascendancy depended not only on ruthlessness but on his ability to navigate the intricate lattice of alliances, betrayals, and law enforcement pressure that defined New York's Mafia ecosystem. In Brooklyn, Gotti convened his lieutenants in a dimly lit club. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. "We've been tested," he said, voice low but commanding. "The city, our rivals, even the law itself. But we adapt. We survive. And survival isn't just about power. It's about respect, strategy, and foresight." Every word reinforced discipline, authority, and cohesion. He understood that perception alone could not guarantee safety. Decisive, strategic action was necessary to sustain influence. Across the river, Costello continued his silent orchestration. Political connections, influence over law enforcement, and careful maneuvering through business and legal channels were his arsenal. He understood that Gotti's visibility created opportunities and risks alike. The balance of power required observation, patience, and the right intervention at the critical moment, a precise measure of when to act and when to remain hidden. The streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn thrummed with the pulse of the underworld. Every alley, office, and lounge became a stage for calculated moves, tests of loyalty, and subtle assertions of authority. Gotti's legend continued to grow, fueled by daring, efficiency, and the very scrutiny that might have destroyed a less meticulous man. By nightfall, Gotti walked along the East River waterfront. The city lights reflected on the water, casting a shimmering path that seemed to mirror the precarious path he navigated. He contemplated the betrayals, the surveillance, and the calculated violence required to maintain control. Each step reinforced the lesson. Survival in the underworld required strategy, composure, and relentless vigilance. Costello, meanwhile, observed from the quiet of Manhattan, considering the shifting terrain. Gotti's rise had introduced variables that demanded attention, yet the fundamentals of influence, the subtle manipulation of loyalty, power, and perception, remained constant. Patience, foresight, and discretion were the tools he relied upon to maintain relevance and authority in a world where visibility and audacity were becoming dominant forces. By the first light of dawn, the city exhaled, yet tension lingered in the alleys and offices, in the whispers and glances of men who understood the stakes. Gotti's survival and the legend of the Teflon Don depended on every calculated action, every observed reaction, and every carefully measured risk. Costello's influence, subtle yet pervasive, ensured that the balance of power remained delicate, a chess game stretching across decades and boroughs. And so New York continued, a city where ambition, audacity, strategy, and survival intertwined. The collision of bold visibility and subtle manipulation had set the stage for the ultimate tests of power, loyalty, and influence in the underworld. Gotti's rise, punctuated by both violence and cunning, and Costello's patient observation defined the evolving hierarchy of the city that never slept. The city had changed, yet remained fundamentally the same, a sprawling, restless organism where power whispered through alleyways and corridors alike. Frank Costello, now in the twilight of his career, sat in his Manhattan office, the skyline of the city stretching beyond the window. Years of influence, subtle maneuvering, and quiet dominance had brought him to this point. Every deal, every whispered word, every act of manipulation had woven a complex web that few could understand and fewer still could challenge. Costello's gaze lingered on the streets below. Manhattan moved with its familiar rhythm, buses clattering, taxis honking, and the occasional wail of a distant siren. But beneath it all, the underworld pulsed quietly, shaped by decades of his guidance. He thought of the young men who had risen in recent years, their audacity contrasting sharply with the patience and discretion he had relied upon. Among them, John Gotti stood out, not just for boldness, but for his uncanny ability to manipulate both fear and perception, creating a legend that transcended his immediate actions. Gotti, meanwhile, continued his reign in Brooklyn and beyond. The title Teflon Don was no longer just a media label. It had become a symbol embedded in the city's consciousness. He walked the streets with a confidence that was equal parts charm, strategy, and calculated audacity. Every glance from a rival, every whisper on the street, reinforced his authority. The city, the streets, and even the law seemed to bend subtly to the presence of the man who had mastered the interplay of visibility and power. In a rare meeting of old allies and former rivals, Costello reflected on the evolution of the underworld. Where once influence had moved silently through political channels, backroom dealings, and quiet persuasion, now visibility and audacity shaped the narrative. Gotti's rise illustrated the new rules. Perception was as potent as force and myth could act as armor. Costello understood the elegance of patience, yet he also recognized the inevitability of the shift in strategy. The game had changed, but the underlying principles remained constant: control, loyalty, influence, and survival. Gotti, aware of his own ascent, considered the lessons of those who had come before him. Costello's reputation as the prime minister of the underworld, his mastery of political leverage and quiet dominance, had shaped the city in ways few appreciated. Gotti's path differed, relying on bold, visible moves and media amplification, yet he absorbed the same principles of loyalty, timing, and calculated force. Each action, each decision, was informed by the interplay of visibility and subtlety, a dance as old as the city itself. Both men, separated by boroughs yet linked by influence, reflected on the legacies they were creating. Costello saw the culmination of decades spent maneuvering in shadows, his name etched into the corridors of power with subtlety and precision. Gotti saw the legend he had cultivated, a persona reinforced by audacity, charisma, and calculated risk. The collision of their methods, patience versus audacity, subtlety versus visibility, defined the contours of the underworld's hierarchy. Manhattan and Brooklyn pulsed with life as the city adjusted to this new equilibrium. Rival families measured their positions carefully, law enforcement recalibrated strategies, and every street corner, lounge, and office carried the echoes of the decisions and actions of these two men. The legacy of Shadows was not a static monument but a living, evolving force, shaping behavior and perceptions throughout the city. Costello, in quiet contemplation, recognized that influence was not merely about survival, it was about shaping the culture, the narrative, and the expectations of those who followed. His methods had endured because they were invisible yet omnipresent, a testament to the power of subtlety in a world dominated by bold gestures. Gotti, walking the streets of Brooklyn in the cool night air, reflected on his own ascent. Visibility, charisma, and decisive action had established him as a force the city could not ignore. Yet he also understood the precarious balance. Every act of audacity carried potential peril, every public move required calculated precision. The legend of the Teflon Don was as much about perception as reality, a living myth reinforced by strategic decisions and flawless timing. The city itself seemed to acknowledge the convergence of these legacies. Manhattan and Brooklyn, distinct yet intertwined, bore witness to a hierarchy informed by decades of subtlety and audacity alike. Power, loyalty, and influence were eternal currencies, yet their forms evolved with the men who wielded them. Costello's shadowed dominion and Gotti's illuminated presence together defined an era, a complex tapestry of control, myth, and survival. As dawn approached, the city settled into a deceptive calm. The streets would awaken, business would resume, and the pulse of life would continue, but the legacies of these two men, one operating in shadows, the other commanding attention, would continue to shape New York in ways both visible and unseen. The collision of methods, strategies, and personalities had left an indelible mark, setting the stage for the final act of influence, reputation, and ultimate authority. And in the quiet reflection of their respective domains, both Costello and Gotti understood one truth: power in New York's underworld was fleeting, yet legacy, the careful weaving of influence, myth, and respect, was eternal. New York was awake, yet the city's heartbeat was as complex and layered as ever. From the narrow alleys of Little Italy to the gleaming towers of Manhattan, from Brooklyn's shadowed streets to the neon glow of Midtown, the rhythm of life pulsed incessantly. Every corner, every fire escape, every whisper of wind through the streets carried stories of ambition, survival, and power. Frank Costello, seated in his Manhattan brownstone, looked out over the city with a calm that belied the storms he had weathered. Decades of influence had brought him here, each maneuver, each whispered deal, each carefully cultivated alliance culminating in a legacy few could rival. Yet he understood the impermanence of power, the subtle shifts that could alter the balance of influence in an instant. Across the river, John Gotti strode through Brooklyn, the streets reflecting the neon glow of his ascent. He had survived scrutiny, betrayal, and law enforcement efforts to unseat him. Every headline, every whispered conversation reinforced the myth: the Teflon Don, untouchable, audacious, and commanding respect with every step. The city itself seemed to acknowledge his presence, bending subtly to the force of his reputation. The collision of their worlds, though indirect, had defined an era. Costello's subtlety, patience, and strategic mastery contrasted with Gotti's boldness, visibility, and calculated audacity. Yet both approaches achieved similar ends: respect, authority, and influence within New York's underworld. In the quiet moments before dawn, Manhattan and Brooklyn existed in a delicate equilibrium. Rivals recalibrated their positions, allies sought guidance, and the city's pulse reflected the shifting landscape of power. The legacy of Costello's shadowed maneuvers and Gotti's public audacious acts intertwined to create a tapestry of authority, respect, and myth that would endure long after their time. Gotti, observing the calm after another successful night, considered the journey. Every operation, every carefully executed maneuver, every headline reinforcing his myth had been deliberate. He understood that survival and dominance required more than audacity; it required foresight, precision, and the cultivation of perception as carefully as action. Costello, in his office overlooking the river, reflected similarly. His influence had always been quiet, subtle, woven through politics, law enforcement, and alliances. Yet he recognized the necessity of adaptation. The world had changed, audacity and visibility had become powerful tools, and Gotti had mastered them. Costello's legacy, though different in style, remained intact, a testament to patience, foresight, and control. The city itself, ever restless, bore witness to their legacies. Manhattan's skyline glittered with the quiet confidence of old power, Brooklyn's streets thrummed with the energy of new ambition, and the underworld's intricate network of loyalty, fear, and influence continued to pulse invisibly beneath the surface. As the sun rose, casting its light over bridges, towers, and alleys, the city remained unchanged and yet forever altered. The lessons of influence, power, and survival were embedded in every corner. Patience and subtlety could control a metropolis. Boldness and audacity could create legends, and the interplay between these forces defined the hierarchy of a world invisible to most, yet omnipresent in its effects. For the citizens unaware of the silent battles and whispered deals, life continued. Subways rattled, taxis honked, vendors called greetings, and the endless rhythm of New York carried on. Yet in the shadows and neon-lit corners, the legacies of Frank Costello and John Gotti lingered, shaping decisions, alliances, and ambitions. By nightfall, the streets glimmered with neon, the air carried the scent of food and exhaust, and the city hummed with life. Both men, though separated by boroughs and generations of strategy, existed as monuments to the duality of power. One mastered in the shadows, the other in the light of attention. Together they defined an era, a blueprint for influence, and a testament to the complexity of the underworld. New York had never slept, and it never would. Its pulse, restless and eternal, was a reminder that power was fleeting, perception could be manipulated, and legends, carefully crafted, boldly executed, were immortal. And as the city exhaled into another day, the shadows and lights whispered in unison. Frank Costello and John Gotti, each in their own way, had left a mark that no time could erase. The city that never sleeps had witnessed their stories.